Hi, I'm Steven. You can now watch UCF TV 24 hours a day on Bright House Digital Channel 1.
My title is Three Waves of Immigration, waving without a G, the flag of patriotic fervor. And like the other papers, I was told to write about 25 pages, but talk about 30 minutes. So I'll be summarizing a lot as well, and I'll try and keep an eye on the clock here. To start with, there's been a lot written about the Cuban waves of exile to the United States, basically categorized as three waves. And Gustavo Pérez has come up with the term of the 1.5 generation, or the life on the hyphen generation, that doesn't fit either category. In fact, in one part of that book, he says that while it may be true that neither the 1.5 generation doesn't belong to either the Cuban or the American side, the contrary is true as well, that they're the only group that is marginal to neither. And I found that comment pretty interesting, since they're also considered a bridge generation. And I think after, in some cases, nearly 50 years of exile here, that bridge generation is a bridge that should imply bidirectionality. Of course, the Cubans can't go back to Cuba, though. And I think that bridge is about to implode as the older generation dies, and that Cuban legacy is going to be lost. And I've stated this in an article before, that Cuban culture in the U.S. dies once it gets here, and something new is born, just like Spanish culture. When it conquered the New World, it was no longer Spanish. It fused with the Indian and became Spanish-American. So the Cuban-American is different. I think as the generations get older and older, what we're going to see is that the children of the 1.5 or the second generation will forget what it's like to be Cuban. Fernandez details this in Writing Backwards when he's talking to Tatiana, I believe, and said, let's go to Cuba. He said, Cuba, that's a restaurant that smells like onions and grease. So they forget that. In this paper, what I want to play up is that Fernandez, Pérez, and Virgil Suarez are all included in Southern anthologies now, which I find odd. We get these ideas of ethnic literature of the U.S., and that's what we've heard about all morning with the Italian-American, the Hispanic-American, the Jewish Latino in some cases, that all of a sudden are they considered Southern writers? And this is problematic for categorization. Generally, Cuba won't recognize these writers as being of their own because they would be dissidents. And Fernandez has been included in some anthologies in Cuba now, and in fact was invited to visit and did not, for whatever reason. But the idea of Cubans becoming Southern, I started thinking when I was asked to take part in this symposium, I said, what in the world am I going to write on? And the more I thought about it, I said, Southern writers, they've made the transition, or the apparent transition. Now, the question to me is, are they truly Southern writers, and do they consider themselves Southern writers, or is it a marketing convenience to sell books? I don't have the answer to that. But what I do find interesting is that, for example, Pérez has Carolina Cuban. Now, why privilege Carolina over Cuban? Why not call it Cuban Tar Heel? That strikes me as odd. And one of his poems, I think it's from Bilingual Blues, Dedication, which is also in Writing Backwards. The fact that I'm writing to you in English already falsifies what I wanted to tell you, though I belong nowhere else if not in English. So English is a place, and we've heard a whole lot about that with the diagram of home, mortality, immortality, paradise. I'm trying to remember everything there. Langage, and I don't, lang, so poetry, prose. that you're always struggling with this. And I think it's not a far leap for a Cuban-American that has been living in the South for the majority of his life to make the step to Southern. I can think of no other regional literature in the U.S. that's taught in university English departments as a genre to itself. You don't hear Western literature, Northeastern literature, Midwestern epics. But almost every university offers the Southern novel. So what I see in common between these two cultures, and I'm about as Southern as it can get, I guess, since I grew up in the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia. What you see is we both come from plantation societies that have an emphasis on tobacco. We apocopated our final syllables. Cubans drop that last syllable, so do Southerners. You don't say fishing, you say fishing. You don't say hunting, you say hunting. And Fernandez has parodied this in some of his works in Spanish, the linguistic idiosyncrasies. If you go anywhere else in the country, though, a Southern dialect is considered substandard. When I started my doctorate in linguistics at the University of Washington, I was told I spoke with a substandard dialect of English. At Virginia, taking a public speaking class, a teacher told us, and I think she might have been Puerto Rican, she was from New York, Manuela Reynolds, anyone who speaks with a Southern accent will fail this class. And right then I refused to lose mine. I said, I'm not going to have somebody else dictate my culture to me. And I think you see this with the Cubans as well. Caribbean dialect in general, I've been around lots of professors since I'm in a language department, various universities who say that Spain is the prestige dialect. Anybody from Cuba, Puerto Rico, or the Dominican Republic does not speak Spanish. And some of the people here may have heard that as well. So I think we're ostracized, and we feel that the Cubans that have moved here came when their possessions were expropriated, and I think that's happened in the South as well, that nearly 150 years after the Civil War, based on a northern concept of one union, or the war between the states based on an idea of two separate political entities and a southern notion. Anthony mentioned this when he said that his great-grandfather or grandfather came over from Italy in 1865 and went back to Italy because everything was so devastated. I think we're still recovering from that economically and educationally, and this idea of identity that we've spoken about is played up the same way. The idea that most Americans have of a Cuban-American is Scarface. The idea that they have of a Southern American is from Deliverance. If we're all a bunch of inbred hillbillies that don't really speak well, and Pettis Ferdinand mentions this about the language spoken in Miami, the Nuliglot, the Nilingüe that doesn't speak Spanish or English. I think there again, it's not a far step for a Cuban who's been here for a long time, living in the South, that is taught in Alabama and Tallahassee to make that step and feel Southern, because our dialect, as I've pointed out, has not been one of prestige either. In fact, you could look at Tom Petty's song, Southern Accents, where it says, there's a Southern accent where I come from, the youngins call it country, the Yankees call it dumb. Now, all this I'm going to play up later on as I get into a specific work by Fernandez. It's called Is in the Stars. It's one of his more recent works. And what I want to talk about is the idea of the flag that we've heard also today. In the Italian-American establishments, you'll see an Italian flag. In Miami, and Pettis Ferdinand points this out too, in Miami, you'll probably see a Cuban flag flying in a restaurant or some business. You know you're not in Cuba, but you feel at home. Now, in the South, that idea of the flag has been pretty prominent as well, especially in recent years as it's been removed from the Georgia state flag. South Carolina suffered the boycott when the NAACP said that they would not they would not conduct tourism in South Carolina as long as the Confederate flag was flying from the state capitol. 2 weeks ago, I was watching debates, and the primaries, I guess it was about 2, maybe 3. Hannity and Combs, I believe, were asking Mike Huckabee, how does it feel to be in South Carolina and see all those people waving a Confederate flag? Is that who you want behind you? So there's this stigma of ostracism in a certain regard. You know, you could put the Italian flag. I know my father-in-law has a Peruvian flag on his car, but if you put a Confederate battle flag, right away you're a racist and a bigot. So we're one of those groups that doesn't really get to show any pride, and I think it's because we're still living in an occupied territory. Now, I mentioned this. I was talking with my boss about this, and he said, have you ever looked at a map? Now, he's from Illinois. He says, have you ever looked at a map of military bases in the U.S.? I said, no. So I went online. The internet is such a wonderful thing. Within about 2 seconds, had the map with all the bases. There are 201 military bases in the U.S., presumably for defense. Out of them, 89 are in 13 southern states that form the Confederacy. The other 112 are in 37 other states. That comes out to an average of 7 per southern state, 3 per everybody else. 4 states, Virginia has 17, Texas has 16, Florida has 13, and Georgia has 10. 56 bases in 4 states, a fourth of the bases in the U.S. And my question is, if this is for security, with 17 bases in Virginia, how did the Pentagon get destroyed in 2001? So you can read into that what you want, and I may be a little off base on that. But anyway, Fernandez, in a panel discussion here, was asked why he wrote his last few novels in English. And he said, this was in 1996, I write in English so that future generations of Cubans in America will be able to read me, which I found interesting too. So there's that idea of losing a language, and I see that in the South as well, that you don't hear a Southern accent as much as you used to, that with the internet and news, people are trying to sound more mainstream, if you will. Now, going back to this idea of the flag, in La Vida es un Special, in La Montaña Rusa, we see a character named Linda Lucia, who is dyed to look like a Cuban flag, and her mother rents her out for events, and she's permanently stained by this dye. Well, in Fernandez's 2001 work, Is in the Stars, there's a girl from the Ozarks named Amber Marie who becomes a country singer. Interesting to me, she's dyed to look like the Confederate flag, with the stars and bars running down her arms and legs. And she is shipped to Philadelphia, which kind of parallels the stories of basically Operation Peter Pan in the earlier works where Cuban children were sent over. And she's taken it, her family won't take her in because they're afraid of what everyone else will say in the city of brotherly love. A black woman from Haiti, Mama Loa, or I guess Mama Loy in English, takes her in. Now, that's one of basically 2 references to Cuba in that last work. And here again, that disappearance of language. In the earlier works, you see a lot of focus on Cuba and the nostalgia, just as you would see in Southern writers, that lost glory of the South in somebody like Faulkner. And Is in the Stars, what you have is this Haitian woman whose name is pretty much right out of Alejo Carpentier's El Reino de este Mundo. Mamanois, who helps the slave Macandal rebel. So that's one reference. The other is in the syntax of the title, Is in the Stars. Makes no sense linguistically in English. So you have to think in Spanish, Está en las estrellas. So those are the only 2 references, but the language has pretty much disappeared. And I think what's happened is that in Fernandez's works, going back to Linda Lucia, she doesn't understand why she's painted to look like a Cuban flag. She just says, it was decreed by the elders. It was in sacred writings that I should look like the flag and be chained. And By the time he gets to is in the stars, Amber Marie doesn't know the reason why she's painted like the flag either, except to take part in competitions. And there are several festivals, such as, let me find them here. The Jackson Peanut Festival, Jefferson Davis's birthday, the Watermelon Festival, PTA meetings, the Secessionist Movement Rally, and the annual meeting of the Daughters of the Society for the Return of the Good Old Society. So that's something that's never going to happen. I think now, when I was a kid growing up, my grandparents had more of an idea. They would probably be like the first generation Cubans to come here. And my kids would have no clue. They just think it's a flag that's flown. They see it. I don't know anything about it. But growing up in Richmond, and this is the irony of some of these things to me, it was the capital of the Confederacy. I moved to Georgia, and I'm called a Yankee because of my accent. So once again, I go to Seattle, and I have a substandard dialect of English. I go to Georgia, and I'm a Yankee. When the short story by Fernandez, Amber Marie says she was paraded around on a pickup truck sitting on a bale of hay while the Cotton song played. Right off the bat, that tells you she doesn't even know Dixie, which was pretty much the national anthem of the South during the Civil War. That would be untrue for anybody born in the South. And she has to hold up a sign that says, "Yankees go home." Now, I find that interesting. When I go to Latin America, of course, all Americans are Yankee. So here again, you have this idea of identity. To call a Southerner a Yankee is about the worst insult you could do. It's like saying something about his or her mother. So we've got this that ties into Raining Backwards, which is considered to be framed by the idea of the flag, where the novel begins with the last American to leave Miami, please bring the flag, which refers to a bumper sticker that was seen back in the 80s. By the middle of the novel, that changes to, will el last americano, si vous plaît, bring the bandera, because of the influence of the Haitian, Central Americans, and South Americans that have gone into Miami. Now, if you think of an American as a Yankee, and then you see this progression to Yankees go home, on one hand, you could think, okay, this is the response by all the hyphenated Americans to say, get out of here. On the other hand, if Fernandez does consider himself to be Southern now, then it's okay. People from the North, get out of here. Stop moving to Florida and buying these retirement homes. I don't know his logic on that, and I called him up. He wouldn't say anything. He said, just give your paper. So I said, okay. What am I doing on time? Probably about 10 more minutes. Anyway, in one of Petitfrid de Mott's works, and I believe it was Life from the Hyphen, yeah, it wasn't the 50 Lecciones, he mentions that Cubans have dug in, they're here to stay, they endure, which I find interesting. If you consider this step from Cuban to Southern, the last lines of Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury are they endured. And the more I thought about this stuff when I was considering how to write this paper, I was going, okay, the South is still trying to relive a past that it will never see again in some parts of the South. And I know Anthony told me he taught in Auburn, Alabama. That's about as deep south as you can get. So I'm sure he's seen his experiences there. He pointed out just the ethnic communities, the differences in California, the Northeast, and Boca are so vast. I think we have those same differences in what would be called mainstream culture, that if you pull a Southerner out and take him to the West or the North, he's going to be identified right away. Y'all can look at the depictions in the media. For instance, First Blood, one of the Rambo movies, takes place in Oregon, but the rednecks all have Southern accents. So we're kind of like the Cuban-American or the Italian Americans, you know. They're all like Rocky or The Godfather. We don't see the good roles that probably all of us have seen in our own communities. And this idea of the Confederate flag for racism at times, it really disturbs me, since I look at my family. I married a Peruvian. My brother married a Jew. My sister married a Puerto Rican. I just don't see the bigotry there when you weigh it out. Maybe we're atypical, but let me see where I want to go with this now, since it's summarizing. The anthologies that Fernandez are included in now are race mixing Southern fiction since the 60s. And then he, Pérez Firmat, and Virgil Suarez are included in Southern Writers, a new biographical dictionary. Now, I know Gustavo has since moved to New York, and I wonder how he feels about being called a Southern writer. I'm guessing this is basically from the days at Duke, or are they looking at all the time in Florida? I know he went to school in Michigan. What sort of feeling that creates in these writers? That, okay, you have been assimilated. Now, there are critics who say, such as Virgil and his wife Delia Poy, that Cuban-Americans do not assimilate. They adapt. They bend and stretch and make their own rules. There are others, for instance, I say that Cuban culture dies and that something new is created. Humberto says that those who don't assimilate, Humberto Lopez Cruz, those who don't assimilate are left behind. And there's a Spanish quote in here that I would have to hunt for. And it's not, no. So that leaves it open. If they have become Southern writers, according to all media, the region that is most biased against anything that is other, how have they achieved this acceptance? So, anyway, at the end of Raining Backwards, I know I'm jumping all around here, the paper's a lot more logical. There's a quote, "I can assure you that this flag will be returned in a free Havana." That was Kennedy's Orange Bowl promise in 62, 63. And the flag has never been returned. In fact, as Gabriela Ibieta points out in Transcending the Culture of Exile, the survivors of the Lincoln Brigade had to sue to have the flag returned to them. It was in a storage box at the Kennedy Library in Massachusetts. I think box is a pretty good term there when you think about Spanish, since caja could also be ataúd, a coffin, that you've got this thing that's dead. We're both living frustrated lifestyles in some cases to regain a past. It's not going to happen. What will be interesting now that Fidel has announced his retirement, withdrawal, whatever we want to call that, this week, what will happen in the near future? And I have no prediction for that. But what Humberto says is, está claro que Fernández no ofrece posibilidades a la supervivencia de la cultura cubana en el sur de la Florida. El autor propone una paulatina asimilación del individuo, quedándose rezagados aquellos que no logran una integración. Fin de cita. Now, the paper he's going to give right after this one should be interesting, since the title is Una ruptura en esta asimilación. So I'll be interested to see what he says. Anyway, I got about 5 more minutes here, I think. What I'd like to conclude with is, if we look back to the idea of the so-called waves of Cubans that have immigrated to the United States, wave is an appropriate word since it is so fully charged with meaning. As it is currently used, it's more like an oleada. But waves crash on the beach and the undertow pulls them back into the ocean. These immigrants cannot return to the ocean, though. A more appropriate definition would be olas, since they are really saying hello to a new life. Related to this is their patriotic fervor that is most obvious in waving the flag, which would translate as ondear or flamear. Is it a coincidence that Amber Marie's mother, and is in the stars, is named Wavine, which would sound more like the Southern, I'm waving at you. So, a syncope occurs when the final G is dropped. This is yet one more similarity between Southerners and Cubans, the dropping of initial and final consonants. Wavine also appears in Holy Radishes, where she becomes good friends with Nellie, and she seeks to preserve the culture of the antebellum South. She goes so far as to buy pictures at pawn shops and creates a fake family album of a plantation called Fairview, so that people will think she had more than she really did. And Fernández really parodies this in La Vida es un Special, La Montaña Rusa, Raining Backwards, even Holy Radishes, this idea of creating a whole new identity. And I wrote an article on Holy Radishes some years ago that dealt with that, called Holy Radishes, Image is Everything, playing on the Andre Agassi tennis camera commercials. But to me, the difference between Southerners and Cuban-Americans are not so disparate, since both groups, chop their words, come from plantation heritage, and whose villains, Lincoln and Castro, you won't see a statue of Abraham Lincoln in the South. I was trying to think, out of all the places I've been, I think only Tallahassee has Lincoln High School. In Richmond, you'll see a statue of Arthur Ashe on Monument Avenue with all the Confederate generals. You won't see anything named Lincoln there. Savannah, same thing. There's, I think, Lincoln Square, but you won't see a statue. So the great emancipator for most of the nation is not the hero in the South. But I can think of quite a number of schools just in Richmond. Lee Davis, Jefferson Davis High School, Stonewall Jackson High, Jefferson Davis Turnpike, Lee Bridge, Lee Boulevard, Maury Street, Mosby Street. So a different idea, and that goes back to what I suggested a while ago about this idea of a land that's occupied that will never be returned the way that our forebears would have liked for it to be. Anyway, both groups refuse to relinquish the flags of a bygone era. Both will continue to wave them, even though their children may not know their significance, because they've become traditions devoid of immediate urgency to them. And we heard, I believe it might have been Anthony again, earlier this morning, speak about this loss of historical urgency to the younger generations, that the immigrants who came in the early 1900s, Dago Pete became mustachioed Pete. Same thing with Johnny Rep. Pick any movie and look at the stereotypes of the Southerner. You won't see too many refined, educated ones. Both will continue. All right, I said that. This is the last legacy of exile. Nostalgia gives way to oblivion as the sea of memories turns into the river of Lethe. So I think we're going to see more and more of that. The longer this exile community is here, and truthfully, I don't see people going back. That life has become too comfortable here, and Raining Backwards, Fernandez points that out when Captain Manny says, do you know what honor is? Honor is to live and die for the fatherland. And one of the other characters says, no, Mr. Gonzalez, you know what my idea of that is? To own a Trans Am, have a big condo in Key West or Key Biscayne, I can't remember exactly, and to make a lot of money. And that's the other legacy of exile. You forget your roots, and I think we see this more and more in the South as well. And that's it. Thank you.